Hey, how's it going? Bill Leatherman here for Money Evolution. In this video, I'm going to be helping you to create your retirement roadmap. And to do this, we're going to be going through a hypothetical client situation. So there's going to be a little bit of a case study here. And we're going to be talking about some of the big decisions that they're going to be making as they're going into retirement and how you can prioritize your different goals and really figure out what is most important to you. And there's a couple of variables that we're going to be talking about here specifically. So when we're talking about making your retirement work and getting on track, there's really three things that we can change. One of them is when we retire. So I used to always joke and say I could retire tomorrow if I wanted to, but I may not necessarily like the amount of income that I'm going to be left with to spend for the rest of my life. So I choose to work a little bit longer to get my assets and my ability to sustain that income into a better financial position. We can also save more money between now and the time we retire. But as you get closer to retirement, the number of years that you're going to have to be able to save that money obviously gets smaller and smaller. Also, the amount of compounding that you're going to be able to achieve with that gets shorter and shorter as well too. So it makes a much bigger difference if you're early. You still have 10 or 20 years to go before your retirement. That saving, that extra savings is really going to have a big impact because you're saving for a longer period of time and you also have more years to let that money grow. And I kind of did this out of order. And then how much money you spend in retirement. So the closer you get to retirement, those first two items are really going to be the ones that are going to really move the needle the most. So if we choose to work even sometimes 1 or 2 more years, it can have a really big impact on our long-term ability to sustain the amount of income that we want. And if we spend our money, how much money we spend in retirement, that's going to be another very important factor. So even sometimes reducing that spending by what seems like a relatively small amount, maybe even sometimes $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000, can really have a big impact on what the likely outcome is going to be for your retirement. In other words, to be able to sustain that income for the rest of your lifetime here. And so to kind of get into our situation, just to give you a little bit of context here. So we're talking about Tim and Jill Mitchell. This is a hypothetical client, and this may be similar to your situation or maybe completely different, but hopefully you'll get the idea of some of the things that we're thinking about here. Tim is 60 and Jill is 58 years old. So one of the things as we're talking about creating a financial plan is if there's an age difference between you and your spouse, there's going to have to be some kind of a tool that you're going to use that's going to be able to keep track of that, especially if that gap is even a little bit bigger, because maybe one spouse chooses to work a little bit longer, or even if we're talking about something like Social Security, the age when you're eligible for Social Security benefits or your full retirement age is going to be different. So you may not be turning on those income streams at the same time. So we're going to get into some of the software that we use, the tools for making this all happen, and show how that really kind of gets mapped out there. They would like to explore the possibility of retiring in 2025 at the end of this year. So we'll be looking at that, and they're going to be starting retirement potentially in 2026. And we'll be talking about what that looks like and how they can make some changes to maybe get that on track to where they want it to be. They're open to the idea and maybe even thinking about downsizing their home. That's a very common goal or variable, I guess, that a lot of people have there to maybe say, hey, I don't need all of this space anymore. And if it means I can be in a little bit better financial position to downsize my home, I'm open to that. And the Mitchells are definitely open to that. And they're going to be a little flexible with the spending. And we're going to talk about how all of that works. So the tool that we're going to be using for this is the eMoney financial planning tool. And it's the centerpiece of our financial planning programs, including the Retirement Time Machine. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can head over to our website, moneyevolution.com, or if you want to learn specifically about the Retirement Time Machine, you can go to retirementtimemachine.com. Okay, so let's jump into the software. So what we're using here again is that eMoney financial planning software that we use for the Retirement Time Machine as well as the Money Evolution plan. And we're going to be exploring this hypothetical client situation, Tim and Jill Mitchell. One of the nice things about any financial planning process is the ability to get everything super organized. One of the places that we see that is here on our net worth statement here. So we can see their assets, which total about $2.5 million in total, split between what we call non-qualified or taxable assets. Those are like regular brokerage accounts, bank assets, CDs, things like that. And then retirement account assets split between traditional retirement accounts and Roth retirement accounts. So when we start to build out the retirement withdrawal strategy, that's going to become a big factor in that. The other things that are in here are going to be their primary residence, which is currently valued at $1.1 million. And then the only liability that they have is a small mortgage, relatively speaking, of just $85,000 remaining on their mortgage. So as we go through, we're going to start to model some of this stuff out. And one of the things that the Mitchells were open to was the idea, in order to reach their retirement goals, what they really wanted to do in retirement, they were open to the idea of downsizing their primary residence here. One of the other reports that we really like is going to be the assets report, and specifically the assets by tax type. So as we start to model different things in there, maybe we start working on Roth conversion strategies or withdrawal strategies, we can really see what's happening to these three primary tax buckets as we move through these different scenarios. So we can look at a number of outcomes and what the impact is on several key areas of the plan. So we can see that here, taxable assets are generally going to be those assets that are going to be used up first in the software, but we can map that all in. So if there's something specific, maybe you have a dividend portfolio as a part of those taxable assets and you don't want to touch that, we can exclude that from the liquidation strategy or pick specifically which accounts we're taking withdrawals from. So that's something we'll get into probably in another video as we map that out. Like many people, many of our clients, they have the bulk of their assets in the tax deferred asset bucket and just a little bit in some Roth assets there. Now we're going to hop over into probably what is the centerpiece of the whole financial planning software, which is our cash flow report. And I've talked about this in other videos, but we can see visually here a couple of things very quickly, what's going on with the Mitchells. So the graph on the right may be the most important graph in the entire financial planning program, and it's basically just showing what is happening to their portfolio assets over time. And although they don't run out of money, this goes out to age 95 for them, they're very close. And so it doesn't really give us a high level of confidence because those assets are drifting off in a downward direction so closely. Now, I know a lot of people might say, well, yeah, I'd like my perfect retirement plan would be to die with no money left in my portfolio. But unfortunately, there's a couple things that we just don't know the answers to. One, how long you're going to live. And with longevity improving, there's a good chance that maybe one of them might live past age 95. So we don't want to plan for 0 at 95 and have one of them live to be 105, maybe if medical technology allows for that to happen. And then the other thing is something called sequencing of returns, which is sort of what that Monte Carlo tends to illustrate. And by the way, the Monte Carlo for this particular plan is not giving them a very high level of confidence. It's only 62%. Generally, we want to see that well above 80, 85, and even into the 90s, because something called sequence of returns and having a flat market or a down market, especially if that happens early in retirement, would change this dramatically. And we have the ability to stress test the plan. So we can say what happens if the market went down 20% in 2026 or 2027. We got that early market drop. And 20% is kind of a somewhat normal occurrence, depending on how the markets go. In fact, there's been many times just in our lifetime here that the markets have gone down 50%. We saw that in 2000 to 2003, and we saw it again in 2008. This graph over here on the left just shows us a quick visual representation of money coming in, which is that green line, money going out, which is the red line. Like probably 95% of our clients, they have some bigger gaps in the early part of retirement. And then as Social Security, I think Jill's getting a pension that kicks in at age 65, and then their required minimum distributions, which are actually withdrawals, but they do show up on the positive side of the cash flow is the way the software works that. So we see that line getting a little bit closer, but never throughout the plan does that money coming in ever exceed the money going out. So they're always having to take money out of the portfolio. And then we get down here into the details. And this is really where having a tool like this can really far surpass, I think, what a lot of spreadsheets can do in terms of if we click into these columns, we can see more specifically what's happening there. So we said, okay, they're going to retire at the end of this year, 2025. So their first full year of retirement will be 2026. And we can see visually here, we see that period of time in the early part of their retirement where there's no money coming in. So they're going to have to rely 100% on the portfolio assets for that. There's Jill's pension kicking in at age 65, and then Social Security benefits. And they're 2 years apart in age, which is somewhat typical that you're not going to be necessarily the same age as your spouse, and there may be a bigger gap than even 2 years. You might have a spouse that's 5 years older or younger than you, or sometimes even 10 years older or younger. And so that's going to change that time when they're eligible for those Social Security benefits. Now, we always begin each plan with a default of taking Social Security at full retirement age, which for them and most people probably watching this would be age 67. And so we can see that, and we see this first year, for example, for Jill, that's going to be a partial year because it's going to begin actually on her birthday in that year, and then the full benefit kicking in there at 2035 when she's 68, and Tim will actually be 70 at that time. But they will have $103,000 coming in from Social Security benefits at that time. The expenses, I think, is really where we can get very detailed on this as well. And we break the expenses into a couple of different categories. We have what we call base living expenses. So that's going to be just food, groceries, entertainment, hobbies, personal care, things like that. And so for the Mitchells, they have about $51,000 of those living expenses. We break out the mortgage and the home expenses into two separate categories for the specific reason that we're seeing here. Their mortgage, which is only $85,000 right now, is going to be paid off somewhere in 2027, probably maybe halfway, three-quarters of the way through the year there. And so those liability payments are hopefully not going to continue forever in your plan. You might have multiple mortgages, or you might have other debts or liabilities. Maybe you're helping kids pay off student loans. Whatever that may be, we can put that all in here. We can actually work through a scenario to help you pay that debt off faster, and how much more should you be paying towards principal, and how fast will that pay those debts off, and what does that do to your cash flow. So we can look at a lot of stuff there. Real estate expenses is going to be property taxes and insurance, and then all of the associated costs with that property, including utilities and maintenance and leaf cleanup and pool maintenance, whatever you might have for your home. Because if we do a buy-sell, like we're going to get to here in just a few moments, we want to have the ability to say, okay, this house is going away, and included with that are all of those expenses associated with that house. And then we're going to buy a new house, and it's going to have a new set of expenses. So it may be, some people are upsizing their house as they go into retirement. We don't find that quite as often, but we've recently worked with a couple clients where that was the case. Other expense flows is where we can really dial in some of those other expenses that may be coming in just for a short period of time. If you want to budget in a specific travel budget for maybe the first 5 years of your retirement, we have a couple things here. We have their current healthcare expenses, which is while they're working, that's going to go away once they retire, but then they'll have to go and get some insurance because they won't be eligible for Medicare yet until age 65. So typically that pre-Medicare insurance is quite expensive. We think it's usually about twice as much as what Medicare costs are. And so we see that here. And because they're 2 years difference in age, there's going to be a 2-year difference between when Tim is going to be eligible for Medicare and when Jill will be eligible for Medicare. So we see that here. And we also know from the past 20, 30 years that healthcare costs go up at a rate that's about twice as much as the normal rate of inflation. So we have inflation built into all of these numbers. The default for inflation in the plan is 2.44%, which I think is pretty reasonable. That's slightly above where the Fed's target is at 2%. But for those healthcare expenses, we're actually using a 7% inflation on that. So it's actually more than double the rate of inflation for every other expense that's in here. We put a wedding in there. So their daughter, Sarah, no plans to get married yet, but they know at some point, or hope at some point, there's going to be a wedding that they're going to want to fund. And so we put in a $50,000 expense, and we just earmarked it there for 2028, but we can slide that around maybe as that engagement happens and they figure, hey, it's going to not be 2028, it's going to be 2030, and we can move that around. And that's going to go into that retirement cash flow and income plan too. So you know, hey, next year we got to take some money out for that wedding that's going to happen here. We've got some car expenses, a couple leases that we put in there. They're also right now helping to financially support their youngest son, David. So we've got a $4,000 expense that's just going to go for the next 3 years. And then we have some travel expenses in here too. We said that while they're working, their expenses for travel would be about $8,000 a year, but in retirement, it would be $15,000 a year. So we can see that, we can see the inflation attached to that. The other expense that is in here is going to be taxes. And I'm not going to get too into the weeds here on taxes in this video, but I have in other videos, and I'll make some new videos too that will show you just how detailed some of this tax is in the software and how they calculate those taxes. So it knows that Social Security is taxed only up to 85%. It knows that taking withdrawals out of a retirement account is going to be taxed at ordinary income. It can even go as far as with those non-retirement accounts, knowing that, hey, you've got $400,000 in a non-retirement account, the cost basis on that is $200,000. As you take money out, it's going to actually showcase what those capital gains are going to be. Or if you have a dividend portfolio, we can tell it how much in dividends are you getting from that portfolio. And dividend income and long-term capital gains are taxed at a preference rate. The software knows that and will calculate that tax. It's also not going to go into your income tax base. So it's not going to push you into a higher tax bracket to have that qualified dividend income or long-term capital gains. So those taxes are going to be calculated here. And as we move things around, it's going to constantly be not just showing us what's happening on the cash flow side, but also what's happening in the tax side. So again, going back to the main cash flow, 62% probability is not ideal. So we're going to start to look at a couple of scenarios. And what could they do? Well, there's 3 things really that they could do. They could maybe work a couple more years, maybe 2 years or 4 years. They could spend less money. We talked about downsizing their house. So let's look at a couple of those here now. And we mapped all this out already. So you don't have to watch me type all of this in. And so the first scenario we're going to really look at here is we're going to look at working 2 more years. And I think that's this scenario right here. And we can see that has actually I think that's 4 years of additional working. And so we can quickly see the blue lines, which is what was in our base facts. And so just like we're doing a science experiment, we always want to have a control group so we can see, okay, here's where we're at right now. Let's make one change or maybe a couple of changes and we'll see what the improvement is, hopefully, or maybe it's not an improvement. We'll see what that is. So this actually gets them into a very, very high level of confidence. But again, Tim and Jill, they don't really want to work 2 more years. So the next scenario we want to look at here, this is kind of an interesting one. And this is saying that they're going to work 2 more years, but kind of as a reward for working those 2 additional years, they're going to spend a little bit more money on their travel in those first 2 years. So that's exactly what we did here. So we put that in, and again, it's giving them a much better scenario. I think this ended up being a 99% probability that they were going to actually, it was a 95% probability that they were going to have that money last them for the rest of their life. So very high level of confidence here. And essentially what we did is we increased their travel by $25,000 over the next 2 years while they're still working, and then kept that original $15,000 lifetime travel expense throughout their retirement there. The other thing we looked at here too was just, hey, what happens if we keep everything else the same? We retire at the end of the year like we're planning, and we just downsize our house. That has a really, really big impact here, and actually better than working 2 more years, even with that extra travel there. So downsizing that house had a really strong impact, and that was because we not only cut a couple of years off, or maybe a year and a half off of that mortgage, but we did a few other things. We ended up with, if we go into the plans here, we ended up having a $239,000 surplus. So what we did here and how we mapped this out, so we said their home right now is $1,100,000. There was an inflation that was calculated on that house. We can take that out if you don't want that in there. We also know what the mortgage balance is going to be next year when they go to do that. So we said this was going to happen in 2026. And although they owe $85,000 right now, the plan knows that through those payments that we said they were making, that mortgage balance is going to be $53,000. We we also put some expenses in there. Typically, we would use 7.5%, which would cover maybe a 6% realtor fee, and then maybe another 1.5% for some miscellaneous cost like transfer tax or some other staging of the home or moving costs or whatever that may be. And you could really put anything you want in here. So we can get very detailed as we put this in here. So you can add those extra expenses to this. If you say, hey, 7.5% is not enough, or maybe that's too much, whatever that may be. We said that their new house was going to be $750,000, and so their current house, we said, had about $41,250 of expenses, and that was property taxes and then all of the other expenses included with that. But on the new house, because it's going to be a little bit less expensive of a home, we said those expenses, the property taxes were going to be a little bit less at $7,500, and then those maintenance expenses, utilities and things like that were $21,000. So effectively, we're improving their cash flow long term from 2026 through the rest of their plan, through the rest of their life. They're improving that by $12,750 of less spending, and that has a big impact with that. So that is another very positive thing to look at. And so as you're having the conversations with our team during your meetings or meeting, if you're talking about the retirement time machine, we're going to be able to dial this in pretty easily and quickly. We can do all of this stuff on the fly very easily. I just did to keep the video a little bit shorter and map this out in advance, but it really just takes a minute or two for each one of these different scenarios here. But this one right here, I think maybe we'll just kind of end with this one right here. And what this is a combination of a few different things. So we said we're going to downsize the house. They're going to work 2 more years. And then they're going to increase their spending budget on travel from basically $8,000 to an extra $25,000, so like $33,000 in travel expenses there. And they're going to also increase their travel in the early part of retirement. So we did a bunch of things here. So we said their travel expenses while working were that extra $25,000. We basically pushed retirement out 2 years to start at the beginning of 2028. And then we reduced the amount of money that they were saving in their 401k. So right now they're maxing them out according to our hypothetical plan here. They were putting $30,000 each into the 401k, but they decided, hey, we're just going to cut that back a little bit. We're going to do $15,000 each. Make sure you're still getting the match on that, and that's going to give you a positive cash flow to be able to do that travel in the early part of retirement here. And so that looked really good. And when we go into the probability or to the plan, we can see what that looks like here. And so that looks fantastic, and I think that gives them like 100% probability of achieving that according to the Monte Carlo. Again, there's always things that we have to worry about with the markets and things like that going wonky. But if we come back to that, let's go back and let's change a couple of other things and say, hey, that plan looks good. We're liking that idea of downsizing the house and increasing our travel budget. But let's add in a couple of other things. Let's say that we're going to add in an extra expense, give you an idea of how easy and quick this is. And we're going to say this is going to be early retirement travel. And we'll call that travel. Doesn't really matter what we call that typically. But we're going to say that's going to be $30,000. And we're going to start that at retirement. And we're going to go for we're going to go for 15 years. So we're going to say they're going to be about 62, I guess, when they retire. Jill will be 60, Tim will be 62. So that'll take them out to the early 70s there for that. And we are going to put that in, and first of all, let's look at the Monte Carlo. Let's see what this looks like. Now, I've made other videos where Monte Carlo isn't my favorite tool to use for really evaluating the plan, but it is a benchmark, and it's a benchmark that we can keep consistent. So we still have a 97% probability according to this Monte Carlo estimate. And then if we look at the reports that we were just looking at here, we can see what that's doing compared to the base facts. So that is going to be our combo, and we added that extra expense in there. So it still is giving them a very good long-term cash flow projection. So anyway, so as you're planning retirement, again, this is what we call the retirement roadmap. And it starts with, basically where are you at right now? And what are those income and expenses that you have currently? How much are you saving? And then kind of going into the future and saying, hey, I'm not really sure what my retirement's going to look like, but here's a starting point. I want to ideally like to retire in 2 years, or I'd like to retire at the end of this year, or I think I've got 5 or 6 more years. And then kind of going through and figuring out like what are some of those expenses and what's going to be different about your expenses at retirement than what it is today. So for example, if you're still like I am in my 50s, my kids are pretty much out of the house right now, but maybe your kids are still in the house and you're still helping them through college or helping them with things. And you're expecting that as you go into retirement, you're not going to have some of those expenses, or your mortgage is going to be paid off, or whatever that may be, then you're going to figure out what those expenses are. So basically, where are you right now? Where are you going? And just like I talked about in another video, it's that map. In order to get to where you're going, you have to know those two things. Where are you and where are you going? And that's very important. And then you get an idea, like Tim and Jill came in, we looked at this and said, hey, you know what? Those initial goals that we had didn't look overly great, wasn't giving us a very high level of probability. So what are some of those things that we can slide back and forth? Can we move retirement out a couple more years? Is there a possibility to reduce the spending? One of the ways we achieve that is through the downsizing of the house. Another way that sometimes people do is they say, hey, we're driving really expensive cars right now. Maybe you thought you had to for your job, or maybe you had to have a certain image or whatever, but in retirement, maybe you say, hey, that whatever, $700-800 car payment, even sometimes $1,000, $1,500 car payments, maybe we can cut that down, maybe we can cut that in half. And again, we saw just with that downsizing of the house, we cut out about $12,000 worth of expenses, and that had a huge long-term impact. So sometimes the needle doesn't have to move very far to get us back on track to where we want to be, but seeing it all develop and then kind of prioritizing, with you, or if you're married, your spouse, to kind of see what are the values and what are the things that are most important to you as you're building this whole thing out. So anyway, if you'd like to learn more about what we do with that financial planning, you can head over to our website, moneyevolution.com. This is all available inside of both of our retirement planning programs, the Retirement Time Machine and the Money Evolution Plan. Basically, most people are going to probably find that the Retirement Time Machine is going to serve them very well. It's a lot lower cost, and really the Money Evolution Plan is going to be for much higher net worth individuals that maybe have a lot more complexity to their financial situation, multiple pieces of property. Sometimes we have clients that have dozens or sometimes even multiple dozens of investment properties with income and expenses. They have a business. We're working out details of selling that business and how to transition that, or executive compensation things like stock options, restricted stock, and the software is excellent at being able to map that out and really giving us that ability to do tax planning out into the future with restricted stocks that are coming due, for example, and as that's hitting your income tax return. Deferred comp is another one, but this is all possible inside what we're doing here is all possible in both programs, but including the Retirement Time Machine. So anyway, if you like the video, don't forget to hit that like or subscribe button, and I will see you back in one of our next videos. Thanks.